Hi, I want to thank you for joining us for conversations on racism in the United Methodist Church. My name is Rudy Rasmus. I serve a church in Houston, Texas, a Methodist church, and have for the last 29 years. It's been a journey, and I'm glad you are joining us today on this journey. We're going to be talking about a book. The book is entitled I'm Black, I'm Christian, I'm Methodist. And in this book, I've asked nine other authors to join me on this journey through the sojourn of being Black, Christian, and Methodist. And each of them have taken their life journey as mostly pastors and clergy, and how their lives have intersected with being Black and Christian while being Methodist. I want you to know that this time that we're living in right now is specifically a unique time, but not so unique in that our journeys, regardless to our age, our gender, our orientation, or how we view the world, have all in some way intersected. These nine authors are friends of mine, and when I was thinking about bringing this together, I thought about each of their individual sojourns as it related to contributing to this work. And I want you to know we are delighted to be here today with you. I'm so delighted that my friend Garlinda Burton, the interim General Secretary of the General Commission on Religion and Race, is joining us to moderate this conversation. We're praying for her because she's going to be moderating the conversation with some characters. I'm telling you. But it's good to be with you, Garlinda.
Oh, Rudy, it is so good to see you as well. I can't overstate the timeliness of this book. I have now read it twice, and I was thinking last week as I watched the insurrection unfold at the Capitol that we as a church are still uh, continuing to be poisoned by racism, our church, our nation, our world, and that it's past time for us to hear the voices of our prophets and those anointed by God to lead us about how we can continue to move forward. I think these 10 writers, all of you are African American United Methodist Christian clergy. In this book, you've issued, I think, a call to action and a call for transformation of our systems and structures in our denomination as the body of Christ so that we can and that we do rejoin God's work to change the world for the better. So I'm looking forward to this next time, these three segments with us as well. I think it's going to be critical as we see how we are called to claim Christ as Savior and Liberator for the whole world.
It's going to be a good time.
It's going to be a good time. I really appreciated this book. It was right on time for me. It really was. And so I'm excited. Today's conversations will happen in three segments that represent some of the major themes of the book. There's some common themes in the books. There are some unique things that I think will be great to talk about. So, joining us in this segment, and this segment is what has racism cost the church? And we'll be talking both about the United Methodist Church and the larger body of Christ. So joining us for this segment are the Reverend Dr. Rodney Graves, who is the pastor of McCabe Roberts Avenue United Methodist Church in Beaumont, Texas, the Reverend Dr. Lillian Smith, who is pastor of Cheverly United Methodist Church in Hyattsville, Maryland, and of course, Dr. Rudy Rasmus, who is the editor and also a contributor to the book, I Am Black, I'm Christian, I'm United Methodist. So welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hello there.
Hello.
So Lily,
Hello.
I'll start with you. You're a cradle Methodist. Like me, you were born and raised in the United Methodist Church. You were nurtured and reared. You've been ordained and are deployed in the church as a clergy person. So what have you seen in your ministry? What have you seen in your life's work that would count as a cost that racism has been to our ministry? What has racism cost the church? And how can we continue to move the needle so that we are addressing and dismantling racism?
Mm-hmm. Racism has cost, I'll start with the United Methodist Church. Racism has cost the United Methodist Church a whole lot. It has cost the denomination opportunities to be the church, to be seen, continuing to lead related to the issue of racism. Initially, when the merger happened, it talked about there shall not be, or racism will not be accepted, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we started out, we have agencies that address it, but we have not always, from the pulpit, all of the pulpits, and in all of the congregations, dealt with the issue of the heart and the sin of racism. So because of that, we have lost generations of people of African descent, African Americans who no longer are part of the church. I mean, on both sides of my family, I can say about 5 generations back, we were Methodists. One of my grandfathers was Francis Asbury Webb. Come on, somebody.
All right now.
But many of my cousins have left because we have, and some of this is external in racism, some of it's internalized racism, but we have failed to intentionally continue to be relevant and engage communities of people who look like us. And we have lost, okay, young people, we've lost integrity. We have lost the opportunity to show the community and the large, the country, what it means to be the beloved community.
Mm-hmm.
If we as people who are Methodist Christians of all cultures, if we could have dealt with the sin of racism, the country would be a whole lot further. Mm-hmm. It really would. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the things I can think of immediately. We've lost churches. We have lost outreach related to people of African descent in America. Mm-hmm. That's some of the cost of racism. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have communities where Black churches are closing right and left for a variety of reasons, but racism still is a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Rodney, what would you say? I know I loved your chapter in the book, and you talked about a lot of your own experience coming along and confronting racism, including as a pastor. So, based on your experience, what do you think that racism? How does racism impede the ministry of the church? How does it impede you being in ministry in the church? And how do you counter that? Because obviously, if you're still a pastor and you're in the pulpit, you are pushing through. But how do you do that? What are some examples, and how are you pushing through?
Well, I think you counted that: 1, by keep on trucking, 2, by being open with people don't look like you, and also it has cost us the opportunity to fulfill the Great Commission. Curtails our expression of the Great Commandment. I like how when Jesus responded about who's your neighbor, and he starts out by talking about the man who was wounded and stripped and robbed and left on the sideline. Recently, as a result that actually is who was stripped and left on the side, that man actually reflects the Black population in America. Also, in that parable, that's called the parable of the Good Samaritan, what we see is that a priest walked by that man, walked by the man. And when I thought about those two persons, what I thought is, one, when Jesus was telling the story, they don't reflect the good. Now, they didn't do anything bad. Many of my white brothers and sisters and predominantly white churches often say, I'm not racist. Well, saying that you're not racist is not enough. You have to also be in. Those two men in those stories, I assume they were men, the Levite and the priest, they could say that they're not racist, meaning they didn't do anything bad. But the thing is, they didn't do anything good. of loving one's neighbor. So what our church has lost is the opportunity to fulfill the Great Commission.
I get that. I think that is such a good point, and in our work on anti-racism, we say that just not being racist, saying I'm not racist is enough. You have to actively be anti-racism, because racism is always in play, and it is always threatening not just the human dignity of people, but it's the spiritual dignity and our own dignity as church leaders. So I really appreciate that, Rodney. Rudy.
Thank you, and also want to
Oh, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Quiet as a result of what happened last week. So it reinforces the same thing. They're walking by, just like the priest and the Levite.
Say more about that, Rodney. Say that again, because I think it got blocked about last week. Go ahead and say that.
The church has largely been quiet. And when I say the church, I mean actually many of those, I hate to put a name on it, but the evangelicals, who have often been very verbal about what constitutes being a good Christian, have been silent. So that they have done. They're walking by woundedness, and they're ignoring the woundedness of our nation. And also, they are ignoring the obvious hypocrisy or contradiction, as my chapter on Kneeling to Stand says, and yet they have been outraged by athletes kneeling
yes,
to stand.
Double standard, that double
Absolutely.
standard. Yeah. And when we Christians act out of a bias like that, when we're afraid to check ourselves, that's what happens. We end up in a place of being hypocritical, and that mars our witness. I think that's I agree with you. Thank you so much for that. So,
and I know you're getting ready, Rudy.
No,
Rudy, can I say one word? Sunday was a wonderful opportunity in pulpits and congregations in the United Methodist Church and all over the globe, where the whole issue that happened last week was confronted. In my sermon, I told folk, listen, if you've never heard it from anybody else in the pulpit, this is unacceptable. And I went down the whole issue of privilege and racism. It is unacceptable, and it does not give glory to God. And I also said we need to all cry out to God to forgive us, because we're in a bad state. But if people have not heard it before, you had talked about how do we confront it? What can we do to dismantle it? If it's not being addressed from the pulpit and in the congregation related to faith formation and spiritual formation, then people's hearts are not being called into accountability. The sin is allowed to fester and grow, and we're not being the people of God.
Lillian, that's exactly where I was going to go with Rudy. We say as a United Methodist Church that our calling is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And it seems as if, and we hear from pastors at Religion and Race who say they're afraid to preach about racism. They don't know how to preach about it. They've never heard about it. And so, Rudy, what I am pushing on you to answer is, how do we begin to train our pastors and support our pastors who want to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, which includes a clear confrontation of racism and other injustices? How do we help pastors and lay folk to carry this as a gospel mandate?
And I think it's important to understand that first of all, the gospel is revolutionary. The fact that we have been moved into this lukewarm complacency and this comfort with our buildings and our budgets and our status quo. When we really begin to reflect on the life of Jesus, we really begin to think about why we are even talking about Jesus 2,000 years later. Is because Jesus challenged the status quo. I was reflecting on both Lillian and Rodney's responses in terms of the loss that we have experienced along the way. And when I think about the losses, in relation to how we got to where we are, not only did we forget that this was a revolutionary text, but we have lost in large part because we have moved away from relevance, and we have forgotten the importance of our reputation as change agents in the world. You know, Jesus talked about salt and light and those things that can affect the world around us in very concrete terms. But here we are, today, apologizing, for our lineage, our history. So here we are. I'm thinking about the revolutionary aspects of the church and how we have moved away from that, and the costs have been great. Garlinda, I don't know if I told you, but my doctoral research was on Generation Y and somewhat Generation Z. I consider Generation Y the generation. Not only are they deemed millennials by demographers, but WHY is also a pertinent word that the church has not been able to answer. All right, and the cost has been in the departure of an entire generation of potential converts to the cause of Christ. So when we put all of this together, between what Rodney and Lillian pointed to, and then we look at an entire segment of life, an entire segment of society that literally have walked away because we no longer have the reputation of standing up for justice.
Very strong point. Very strong point. I want to thank all three of you for participating during this time. You have challenged us. You've thrown down the gauntlet, and in the next two conversations, I'm sure it will continue. I want to thank Dr. Rudy Rasmus, Dr. Lillian Smith, and Dr. Rodney Graves for being with us today. And we will remind you, the book is I'm Black, I'm Christian, I'm Methodist, published by Abingdon. Thank you all for participating. Our second segment for today is going to address the intersections of race, gender, and LGBTQIA identity. And our panelists are the Reverend Dr. Tori Butler of Good Hope Union United Methodist Church in Silver Spring, Maryland, the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who is Dean of the Faculty and Vice President of Student Affairs at Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago, and the Reverend Dr. Vance P. Ross, who is pastor of Central United Methodist Church in Atlanta, and he is also co-leader of the Black Pastors Institute. Welcome, my brother and my sisters.
Very good to be with you. Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Tori, I'm going to start with you. You reflect in the book, and I love this, about living with the harmful intersection of racism and sexism. And you talked about how Black women are often stereotyped and painted as assertive, angry, and uncompromising. And I want to talk to you about, I want you to tell us about some of your experiences, how that kind of weight has impacted you, and how you have embraced what you talk about as grieving that stereotype, but also self-love and spiritual practices, because I think it's important for African-American pastors and leaders to be able to turn those stereotypes around and find our joy and our purpose. So say a bit more about that, please.
Sure. My chapter was called I'm Black, I'm Young, I'm a Woman, and I'm Grieved. And part of the reason why I started with this grief process is there was such a long period in my ministry where I felt like my voice was silenced. And I felt like the pain of being a young Black and gifted woman, clergy woman, it didn't matter. It didn't matter that I had the same type of training or acumen as some of my white counterparts. It didn't matter how gifted or anointed I was. There was just a stained glass brick ceiling for me. And I talk a little bit about that in the chapter because I call it stained glass, you know, in terms of just the church. And it kind of was symbolized by a stained glass cross that I have on my desk that was given as a seminary gift. And every time I look at the stained glass cross, it wasn't always a symbol of hope. Because every time we kind of see the cross, it's supposed to remind us of resurrection and the power of the transformative power of God. But when I looked at the stained glass cross, it showed me, it was a reminder of the limitations at times. It was a reminder that to watch myself. And what I mean by that is, as a Black woman, your worth is often predicated by how much you can produce. So if I am producing and overproducing, and if I've gotten to the place of burnout, it really doesn't matter as long as I am doing more than what is required of me to do. And so I'm talking about learning how to holler, because for me, I got tired of putting on this trope of the strong Black woman. I got tired of wearing, I'm going to say this, I got tired of carrying bricks around with me. And at some point, I had to learn, well, what does the Bible have to say to me about my pain and the grief that I'm carrying? Where can I go? And so I began to look at Jephthah's daughter in Judges chapter 11, and what we find in this chapter, it is Jephthah, this kind of warrior, makes this promise to God, who says, like, God, if you give me victory, God, if you allow me to succeed in my journey, anything that comes out of my house, I will offer as a burnt offering. And so what comes out of the house is this young girl who like many young women would do if their father had been away on a business trip, she runs out the door and greets her dad. And then the reality hits that her life is not worth anything. And so what she does is says, you know what, you do what you got to do. But then she plans her own funeral service. She kind of takes back her power and says, look, give me some time to go and hang out with my girlfriends in the hills for 2 months, and we're just going to hang out. But what they begin to do there is they begin to cry out to the Lord. They begin to lament. And lament in this sense is crying out to God with the expectation that something will happen. But in this story, there wasn't a change that happened. The only thing that I can name is that there was an internal change that happened. And so lament became not just individual, became communal. It became not just my voice crying out. It became the women around me crying out alongside of me. And so when I began to cry out, I found this new language, and it's called the holler, and it's by Elaine Brown, who talks about this cry against racialized and genderized violence. And so when I learned how to holler, when I learned how to lament, when I learned how to name my pain and not be ashamed of it, that's when I became free. And then begin to invite other women, other Black women into that same space to find a space to be truthful. Oftentimes people are so afraid of being truthful because of the cost.
Right.
You know, I write a little bit about this. Like, there was a time where I was just afraid of, if I were to really tell the truth of the pain that I was in, that it would cost me a good appointment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there comes a point in your life where you have to choose my sanity, my walk with Christ, and this idea that I'm going to be free anyway. I don't care where they put me. I don't care where I'm going. I don't care where I'm serving. The Spirit of the Lord is still so prevalent in my life that I have no choice but to be free. And if you're going to be in relationship with me, it's my job to push you into your place of freedom and let you know that you can holler too. You can cry out against racialized and genderized violence and say that it is not okay.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Reminds me, in the last couple of years, we had to have conversations with members of a board of ordained ministry in one of the conferences, where one of the chairpersons told a Black woman, a candidate, that if you cannot think and act like a white man, you're not going to make it in this church. Told that to her in the meeting. And she was another young, energetic Black woman. And we had to work that through and talk that through. And that's some of the institutional racism that each of you talk about in the book. And Tori, you especially were very poignant in this point about what that weight does to the psyche. And what it's saying is, if you don't act like I think you ought to act, if you don't act like what the white church thinks you ought to act like, not what Jesus thinks, but the white church, you're not going to make it. And that is a weight. That is holler worthy, as you would say. That is holler worthy. So I appreciated you sharing that. Pamela, you walk with this similarly. Tori's younger than you and I, but you have walked with this, and you have also been a strong advocate for queer women as well. So I wanted to ask you, what has been the impact, do you think, as someone who has shepherded other clergy women, of racial bias and stereotyping? And how does that impact the efficacy of ministry, number one, and the Methodist Church, number two? So why is the church having such a hard time embracing women and LGBTQ folks? And what is that costing us as a church?
So, Garlinda, it's good to see you today and to be here with my colleagues. And let me begin by saying discrimination has impacts the Black life at the point of conception. If we're thinking about healthcare, and we're having a lot of conversations during this time of COVID about healthcare, particularly for Black people and especially for Black women. So we don't get away from discrimination. We live with it prior to birth, and we live with it all through our lives. Discrimination is foundational to America. It is also foundational to the United Methodist Church. It is historical to both our nation. I mean, I'm now still trying to work through what took place on the 6th of January, 2021, the insurrection. The insurrection is part of the history. Will go down in the annals of American history. It is historical, and it shows us that discrimination in its historical context leads to torture, to trauma, to insurrection, to the deceit that comes after insurrection, and to death. Now, I'm not simply speaking about the nation. I'm also speaking about our denomination. We have had insurrection in our denomination to the point where we are now on the cusp of schism. Why? Because of discrimination. Why? Because of the distraction of discrimination. I'm really into Toni Morrison now, where she talks about the function of discrimination, the function of racism being distraction. But the ways that racism impacts our lives, particularly the LGBTQ lives, is that it has caused, particularly in our church to function as if implementing laws against LGBTQ persons, and prior to that, women, and prior to that, Black people, the church has thought, Christian folk have thought that if they could somehow legislate, if they could somehow put into place laws that controlled our lives, that somehow that would make the institution better. And what we have found is that it has killed us in it, and along the way to destruction, it has tortured us. It has cost us in so many ways. It has harmed our ministry, and it has harmed our very souls. LGBTQ discrimination is equally racist and equally sexist. And let us not try to separate sexism and racism from homophobia and transphobia. They are equally as destructive and equally as discriminatory, equally impacting our ministry. And unfortunately, some of my colleagues thought that they could have one without the other. Well, when you get in bed with discrimination on any level, you are harming your ministry. You are harming your very soul in the name of Jesus Christ. And let us not forget the pictures that we saw on Wednesday. People were at Capitol Hill hugging the flag and hugging their Bibles at the same time.
My God.
Well,
My God.
I hope I've answered your question thoroughly. And Garlinda, I've been writing about this for decades now. The Bible, I take the text. I mean, the text is a guide for me. When the Bible says cry loud and spare not, I've tried to do that through my scholarly writing. You will see in my writing where I have been warning the church about getting into bed with discrimination and saying to my colleagues, this is not, you think you're only hurting me, but you are hurting the church. And the church is a strange place. They thought, some thought that in striving for laws against LGBTQ persons, that was it. As if Black people are not LGBTQ, are not in that community. That it's racism is all an entanglement. And that's why I have sought to in my writings, show the ugliness of it. And I've also conversely spoke about racism in the LGBTQ community. I've not held my tongue here.
No, you have.
In my writing, I try not to hold my tongue here. There is a pig. There is a hog in the spring, and the church wants a cool drink of water, and you can't get it.
You said that.
Until you take care of the hog in the spring.
You said that.
You can't get it.
See, the folk from up north won't know what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. That hog in the spring.
Muddying up the water. You can't get it. You can't get that cool, clean drink of water. No.
Yep. Yes. Vance, I'm on. Pamela's got me on fire now. So you are a well-respected African-American male heterosexual pastor, and whose voice is strong and people listen to you. I want to ask you, how do we help our Black clergy men to preach a gospel and to embrace a gospel that is joining with our sisters and joining with our LGBTQ family, so that we are standing against racism and discrimination in all forms? You talk about in your chapter, I loved your chapter, where you talked about how we have got to preach the gospel and have a theological conversation instead of people cherry picking the Bible around racism and other forms of discrimination. What is it that you put forth as your theological understanding for us doing that, for staring down racism?
Well, I think one of the things you do to get through that is read this book.
Yeah.
Part of that is to begin to walk in somebody else's shoes. Act like you paying attention to what happens to someone else. It's not you.
Mm-hmm.
And what would it be if it happened to you?
Mm-hmm.
It's the third thing. Stop acting like Jesus could possibly be a citizen of Rome who was blonde and blue-eyed. Stop behaving as if whiteness and those racialized as white and their systems
Mm-hmm.
are indeed and in fact the gospel. Those are not the same things. And we need to stop doing that. Let's be sure we understand that Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates says race is the child of racism, not the father, not the
Yes.
parent.
Yes.
Let's act like we understand that this is something created by somebody else to abuse other people. And once you understand that for you, now let's start paying attention to this Jesus who pays attention to that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not ignore, and everybody not happy about this, but let's not ignore that Jesus is corrected in my limited understanding of biblical text. I think I've got some. He's corrected by twice. 2 women. His mama, boy, get this wine for these people. 2, a sister who says, my baby's in trouble. A sister, you can dress it any way you want to. He calls her a female dog. Now you do the translation.
Mm-hmm.
And she says she ain't going nowhere. And Mac Charles Jones, the late Mac Charles Jones, had a great interpretation of this out of his hermeneutic. He said this woman got on her knees and said to him, you're going to have to prove to me that you're not who you claim you are. If you are who you claim you are, I'm not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Next thing, let's most of us stop acting like we didn't learn most of our theology, most of this biblical thing from women. Let's not. Now I'm one who I'm reared by 2 women, my mother and my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I come from. My mother really gave me spirit. My grandmother helped me understand institutions and social stuff. I didn't have a man around, so that you could argue that there are places and spaces where I may be macho deficient. Having said that, most of us had our lessons in Sunday school, vacation Bible school by women. We heard proclamations from pastors that often did not intersect with what these sisters were showing and teaching. So I think we've got to be very much attentive to those things. We have to, or I have to, or everybody didn't have to use my language, but at some point we have to decide where is it that we find our identities and who makes our identities for us.
Mm-hmm.
Years and years ago, I read one of my heroes said that he was United Methodist who happened to be Black. I love him, but I had to say to him some 6-7 years ago, the Lord gave me something else. No, I'm not a United Methodist who happens to be Black. I'm a Black man who happens to be United Methodist. Mm-hmm. By virtue of free will, I can leave this anytime. Mm-hmm. So I'm a United Methodist Black man. I'm not a Black United Methodist man. Mm-hmm. God gave me the gift of being Black.
All right.
And God gave me the opportunity to choose whether or not I'm going to be United Methodist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I made a conscious choice based on what I saw from women, particularly mm-hmm. in the Women's Society for Christian Service, NAACP, marching for voting rights in the small town of Bluefield, West Virginia. That's what I saw. That's what I was surrounded by. Mm-hmm. Preachers were out front leading for sure. Mm-hmm. But most of the soldiers who were also strategists, tacticians, mm-hmm. were women. Now, it seems to me that if we just pay a little bit of attention to history, United Methodist history, that there's nothing written to my knowledge mm-hmm. pointing to sexuality till 72.
That's true.
Now, if that's so, and I believe it is,
it's true.
How did we get here? It looks like, I'm running to Lightsey now. I'm out of my chapter, I'm running to Lightsey now. It looks to me like We had to find somebody to put out, put down, talk about. We can't be anybody until we're stepping on somebody. Now that's my.
That's your point of insurrection right there, because it's always violent.
Yeah.
Always violent.
Always trying to kill somebody.
Right.
It's not the protest. It's not the protest. It's not the peaceful protest. It's the violence.
Like, let me throw Lightsy in here now. She talked, and she killed me with this. It's hubris. It is basic, fundamental arrogance that finds itself psychologically in everybody somewhere. And if you're not paying attention to it, it becomes sociological, anthropological, theological, and justifies madness.
Yes.
Murder.
Sets itself up against God and against fellow human beings. We are better than it all. We are better than God. We know better than human beings. Hubris.
Yeah.
And this hubris will find itself because you've been dealing with it. You've been raised by sisters. They blessed you. You knew the gay folk in the community. You knew who they were. And in your community, but because you've been this Methodist thing, in this United Methodist, you start buying what they selling because you say, I got to step on somebody too. I'm being stepped on. I got to put my feet on somebody somewhere. And the way you come out of that is you got to spend some time. Barbara Holmes is killing me. Spend some time in some contemplative moments that are uniquely Black. You start paying attention to the drum beat.
Yep.
Let that thing start speaking to you. You get in a spot somewhere and you listen to Roberta Flack or Anita Baker or Luther. Let one of them people speak to your heart.
Yep.
And you start, come on, y'all. Y'all know we've been listening to Luther for years. Now you're going to throw Luther out because of sex.
Okay.
We've been reading Langston Hughes for years. Are we going to throw in? We really going to do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
My limited understanding of literature, the finest essay written in the 20th century, the fire next time. Are we really?
James Baldwin.
Better call that.
Really
James Baldwin.
Baldwin is giving us?
Absolutely.
And don't get me started on Audre Lorde.
Audre Lorde. Yes.
Audre.
Audre Lorde?
Yeah.
Are we really? And Lord, my limited understanding, Lord really gets that identity.
Comes to us through James Baldwin.
Yes.
It's all from James Baldwin.
Yes.
Come on.
It's absolutely true. And I always have that vision of Pentecost where people from every corner and nation are praising God together. And there is no footnote that says these folks weren't invited. If they were same gender loving, they couldn't be there. If they were Black or brown or white, they couldn't be there. We put those footnotes in as a church, and it feels as if, I think this for me as a lay person, this for me is the challenge: is can we be Christian without having somebody to marginalize and hate?
Yeah. Well, see,
we can. We must be, Garlinda, but it will take us to be. It will take humility. Let's turn to our politics right now. We've had a man for 4 years in the White House who takes no responsibility for anything. The height of hubris. The height of hubris, and those who follow him are spinning. They are gaslighting the American public. They are saying this didn't happen. They are saying, well, we need to move on from this. The nation needs to heal from this. They want to take no responsibility for the damage that they've done. Can we heal from it? Can we do that? Yes, but it will take humility, and it will take people coming and saying, you know what? I was wrong.
Yes.
I was wrong.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I got to share this.
Hold on. Can we pass back to Dr. Ross real quick? Because he kind of hits that in his chapter of just being able to bring about that within the structure of United Methodism. And I think it'd be really helpful just to hear a little bit from you concerning the structural piece, because I think that was extremely powerful. Dr. Ross kind of ends the book
Yes, it does.
About the structural racism that we're all facing, and the necessity to name it. And so, Dr. Ross, if you could just talk a little bit to us just about this connection that Dr. Lacey just kind of named for us in the political realm, and how you kind of bridge between the political realm and what's going on in Methodism today, and even in the past.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. I need to say before I get there that your discussion of the holler becomes so crucial. I had no idea when I got to the seminary and learned, because I came from a church that was sedate, quiet. We did high church better than anybody. Didn't nobody do high church better than we did. And I got in a place where people were hollering. I said, "Oh, this ain't Methodist." and I'm in there, and it's feeling good. I'm grooving with it, and I'm getting a sense. Oh yeah, this is Black. This is African. The sense that you're feeling good because this is in your DNA. This expression is, and coming out as a United Methodist Black man who refused to be a Black United Methodist man. Over the years, I have had people attempt to make me quench my holler.
Yes.
Yeah. Watch me.
You're too loud.
They weren't white folk.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they weren't white folk.
Say that.
So I think today the question really is, and I think the book kind of pushes us in this direction. How do we holler when there's no altar?
My Lord.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
My Lord.
Because I think this book is pushing us to ask the question of how do we name the powers that are around us when we don't have an altar to cry out to? Because typically for us as Black folk, when things get rough, we go to church and we kneel at the altar to pray. And we're asking the preacher to intercede for us. And we're asking the saints or the old church mothers to come and lay hands on us as we weep and wail at the altar. So what does it mean for us in this season as we're talking about racism and sexism and all these other isms and political division? How do we begin to holler? How do we begin to lament when there's no altar?
But that's an iconoclastic symbol of religion that we can very well do without as Black people.
Okay.
We can very well do without it as Black people. If we make the signs and the symbols of religion or religiosity our gods, then we are baptizing a kind of idolatry that we want nothing, that we never wanted anything to do with. We've understood always as a people that we could find God in any number of things.
Yeah.
In the sky. Don't you lift your heads up to the and your eyes up to the sky. We see Black people doing it in church all the time. You know, you're talking to the wind even because you understand that God moves and God is in the many places within transcendent and immanent. So we cannot place the sacredness of the divine in a thing. You know, in
and
a
the system, and the system is a thing, and
Yeah,
the system
There we
is
go. Come on, break it in.
a system is perfectly designed for the results it gets.
Right.
And the results we get for United Methodist Black folk are painful at best, annihilating at worst.
Yes.
We've got people, preachers and lay, killing themselves, figuratively and literally.
Yes.
We've got folks, both Butler and Dr. Caldwell Gross talk about the muting of voices.
Yes. Yes.
And the stammer. And it's designed to and for that. Never forget, in 39, they created 6 jurisdictions, 5 geographic, 1 not. In 68, they eliminated the one that was not. The one that gave us at least some, we thought, power, some sense of who we ordained, some sense of how we move and where we move. Nobody even talked about, even now, eliminating the other 5.
Right.
That are by nature and by origin and by purpose, racist.
Racist. Yes. and created to divide the church.
That's right.
Theologically.
That's right. So that we could maintain a way of life for those racialized as white.
Yes.
And we're not talking about any people. We're talking about the system and the leadership that keeps pushing it now.
Especially the leadership, because it is the leadership that teaches in our churches on Sunday mornings, in our Sunday schools, lest we be reminded of a Jeff Sessions.
Yes.
Lest we be reminded that United Methodists make up they're in the top tier of politicians in Congress.
Yes. Yes.
So,
and that's always fine, and that's okay. But let a Stacey Abrams, who is the daughter of two.
Now you preaching now.
My God.
Who comes
my God.
to transform systems? She's demonized by many of our white brothers and sisters and family in our church.
Because she is fighting against the continuation of Jim Crow laws.
Yes.
We thought Jim Crow was over, but Jim Crow laws continue, and they continue supported through our denomination, through the works of many of the leaders in our denomination.
Yes.
So we need to talk about this and talk about how our polity, our church polity, has hurt us in terms of who we are as a people and who we are as Christians, and to be clear about how that has been done over the last 2-3 decades through the hate legislation against LGBTQ persons.
Well, since 72. Yeah. You all, this has been rich. We're at our time. I want to thank you all. I want to thank Dr. Tori Butler, Dr. Pamela Lightsey, and Dr. Vance Ross for just an energizing conversation. And thank you who have joined us. For our next and final conversation, we will be talking about ministry and racism. Thank you very much, panel. You are wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you much.
For our final panel for today, we are going to be talking about ministry, both broad understanding of ministry and ordained ministry, and racism. And our panelists are the Reverend Dr. Aaron Beasley of Germantown United Methodist Church in Germantown, Tennessee, which is in the Memphis area. The Reverend Dr. Javon Caldwell Gross of St. Luke United Methodist Church in Indianapolis. The Reverend F. Willis Johnson of Living Tree Church in Columbus, Ohio. And again, our editor and one of our contributors, the Reverend Dr. Rudy Rasmus, who is the pastor of St. John United Methodist Church in Houston. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. Thank you.
Javon, I loved your personal story in the book. I read it over and over again. It just moved me. I couldn't help but think of the biblical Moses when you were describing dealing with speech impediment. I could not think of Moses and overcoming that that's often attributed to him. I couldn't help but really think of that Moses and stammering tongue, and how Moses became a voice for God and God's people. And you draw on this metaphor about how church-based institutional racism continues to stunt the voices of Black folks. Can you say more of how you have encountered that and what you as a pastor are working to do to overcome that?
So I think a part of that, I think in order to really get at that, the sort of Moses' context for ministry and calling. And his calling was really based off of God's initial understanding of anything that would inhibit God's people. For instance, Exodus 3:7, where God says, listen, I have heard my people, right? Or I've seen their misery. I've heard their cries. I'm concerned about it. Now I'm going to do something about it. And you find right in Moses' call story, you really are connected with this God that is concerned about God's people. So right from the very start, there's this God that has a bend towards biblical justice. And I think for many people, especially when you go into ministry, you don't often, you normally go into ministry because you have a heart to help people. And you don't normally think that you're going to run into racism or something that would inhibit anyone living out their call to be who God called them to be. And I think one of the prime examples of racism, especially within the church, is number one, I think you've got to, every church, every denomination has to really start with itself. Because oftentimes we talk about the evangelical church or the white evangelical church, and we really don't turn the question inward as we talk about the United Methodist Church. It's something very simple and plain. In order for one to really have one's call affirmed and validated, it's always going through a system that is dominated, structured, and geared by white individuals. And so now there's this cultural norm that is so different than your own. There's this cultural norm that's unspoken that says the pinnacle of my faith is normally defined by white individuals, right from even how we talk about John Wesley. I talk about this in the book, that even pastoring Black congregations would hold up this white gentleman right from Europe as the pinnacle and the model example of faith, as the one to aspire to. And many of those Black congregations in some ways held no resemblance to its own community that were Black and brown people, because it was almost trying to emulate, again, the white cultural norm, the white voice, the white perspective, and even white expressions of faith. And so whether you are called to live out your faith as a minister or just called to be a person in the pew, one always had to wrestle and go up against this white cultural norm.
Thank you for that. That raises a very strong point about looking at culture and looking at race head on, and starting inwardly with addressing internalized racism because of what we experience from the outside. So that is extremely helpful. Aaron, I wanted to turn to you. I'm familiar with Germantown, and I know Germantown Church has been working for several years with anti-racism, with an anti-racism faith. And you describe in your chapter the separate but equal mindset that we in the church are still trying to overcome, that we can function separately and remain equal in the church structure. And I'm curious as to what is your latest work at Germantown, and how are you leading that kind of work, and how you would advise new pastors who are coming into a church that is not ready to deal with racism still in many ways.
So over the past several years, I've led a number of conversations on race with my congregation and several others in our neighborhood. There's a cluster of a handful of churches that are within walking distance. So there's a Presbyterian church, a Missionary Baptist church, an Episcopal church as well. And so we've had sort of like this ecumenical experience as well, which has been wonderful. And we've been tackling the very racist history that not only we've experienced in the Methodist Church, but in most mainline denominations. And last year, we decided that we wanted to move beyond the conversations. We wanted to do something practical, because we had talked so much. I mean, for years, we had these very rich conversations, but really felt called to move forward. And we planned a multicultural worship experience together. And we decided to hold it on Juneteenth. So it was a diverse Juneteenth celebration. And it was a bit strange at first because no one really knew what to expect. It was a learning experience for many of our congregations because, unfortunately, a lot of people are still learning about the history of Juneteenth. But it was a fascinating experience to be present with a Black congregation, white congregations, and we also brought in a Hispanic congregation. And it was a testament to the fact that holidays like Juneteenth aren't simply Black holidays, that they're actually American holidays. And we were so grateful that we could lead the way in regards to multicultural worship experiences and the importance of serving as allies for those who are doing a very important work of social justice. And so that was just the beginning for us. And we hope that the Juneteenth celebration would be just one of many gatherings that we would have together moving forward. Unfortunately, we were not able to have our gathering last year because of COVID, but hopefully this year we can move forward with that. And it sparked other gatherings. We've talked about making a better commitment to getting together during Holy Week to have Holy Week services and Thanksgiving celebrations and things like that. So that's where we are. And I recognize the difficulty that churches face in having those conversations. And I touch on that in my chapter. I think most of our United Methodist local churches don't seem to understand the history of racism within our denomination. And that's one thing that I discovered in having conversations in my church. We have middle-aged parishioners who've been Methodist for 20, 30 years, and they knew nothing about the central jurisdiction. They knew nothing about the merger and why the central jurisdiction was dissolved at that time. And it was shocking to me that people could be a part of an institution for so long and not really understand. And then once you explore that history, you begin to realize that we're segregated today because we are a byproduct of that history. And I think that makes it difficult for local churches to pursue the work of racial reconciliation and social justice because they have failed to face, process, and learn from the history that our institution has in perpetuating racism. So I hope that churches would begin to start there and grow from that history and move forward, because racism, I think, is a fire that is still burning within our institution and others. And it's unrealistic to assume that we could move on and put out someone else's fire when we failed to do that ourselves.
I think that's such an interesting point. Not that I'm that young, but the church has only been United Methodist Church has only been desegregated for 60 years now. And when I was growing up, the church was totally racially segregated, and I grew up in the Southeast jurisdiction, and so I remember going to Lake Junaluska on Colored Weekend. And I remember hearing white pastors preaching about us being cursed cursed as the descendants of Ham in my lifetime. Like I said, I'm not old, but I'm not young, but I'm not dead either. And so I think the fact that you have observed and that I hear so much that folks don't know about the racism in our church is surprising to me. Maybe not the central jurisdiction and some of those things, but just some of the reality that racism is a part of our DNA. Willis, I wanted to bring that to you based on what Aaron has started. So you recount in your chapter about why Black people particularly were so drawn to the Methodist movement, the Pan-Methodist movement, including the former Methodist Church in the post Civil War. And at one point, I believe our denomination was 1/3 or maybe more than 1/3 African American. Today in the United States, I think our church is only 8% people of color, and that's 8% Black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, and Native American. So what happened? What happened in our church? And how has racism, if it has it played a role? Because we have gone from 1/3 African Americans, and that doesn't count other people of color, to now 8% people of color.
Yeah, well, I think you've heard across the width and breadth of not only this presentation, but in others that make up this unique anthology of writing and in conversation, that there's a lot of things, but the umbrella or the fundamental issue is racism, and then particularly in that racism, I think first of all, whiteness happened, and I want to be clear to my brothers and sisters who are viewing, who may not be of African or African American descent or othered in particular ways that are common. Nobody has we not beating up on white folk. And it ain't a bad thing to be with white folk. Matter of fact, the small groups and the classes that were formed in the earliest days of this nation and of this movement were comprised of a mixture of people. I note in my writing, as is other historical references in the book, talk about how there were Black people, people of different ilk and social status that were in company with each other, because what the Wesleyan movement held out and held up before people was so humane or so attractive. So easily say and speak to the fact that, one, we have lost we've lost our flavor, we've lost our relevancy. But I'm one that tends to think about this from the standpoint, and being very honest, that whiteness, and when I say that, I'm saying where we as people, as Black people, as African Americans, we adapted a way of worship or a way of being within the spiritual life of Methodism that was not necessarily aligned or affirming of who we were as spiritual people. And so when we become more Wesleyan than the Wesleys, that's a problem. That's very much a problem. We also know about some of the demographic things that have happened across the migration and the evolution of where and how Black people have been able to be present, to locate themselves, to negotiate and navigate. And I think there's a unique piece, particularly I make a note of in my essay around Mother Bethel. We have come to know Mother Bethel out of the tragedy and of the mass shooting that took place there. And Black church has not been exempt from violence and in an effort of genocide. And I thought it was interesting when doing the due diligence. I won't insult. We got too many other scholars who are actually doing the work. I won't insult my work as research. When I did some due diligence and looked at some stuff, it was interesting to me that Mother Bethel was an amalgamation of all the Black folk in Charleston, leaving the three major white Methodist churches of Charleston to come together and make not only a stance, but to make what has now lived through and on through history to be Mother Bethel. Well, you know what? We can learn a lot from our ancestors in Methodism, Pan and otherwise. Because right now, as a church, and if we want to really deal with the whiteness or the racism and the challenges that we face in this denomination, particularly as it relates to a ministry mandate, let's be honest. Most of us across this connection who are part of majority numerically dominant Black people in a Methodist church probably need to organize ourselves and walk around the corner and half a block down to the east or the west of where we are. And instead of being 20 or 15 of us huddled together, striving and struggling and not paying pastors, but paying apportionments, and having buildings fall in on us, and robbing Peter to pay Paul
Mm.
and the episcopacy?
Mm.
Maybe we might just need to come together. And so I said a whole lot and didn't say anything because somebody's stuck on whiteness. But as I've said often and before, we have to reclaim and rekindle our understanding that we were Black and Methodist before 1968. Matter of fact, we were thriving,
Yes.
as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at our history since 1968 in this present structure, as Dr. Ross challenges us to look at, we have done very little but decline. A few have risen.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't discount our ancestors, our brothers and sisters who vehemently, wantedly desired to challenge the church to be the beloved place and community. But we can do bad by ourselves.
Well,
and we can do better together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what I hear you calling for, Willis, is that one way that we can strengthen our ministry is to do more things together, to combine our power, because the church system does set up sometimes a competitive system that is detrimental to all ministry, but particularly with ourselves, where we don't even want to work together. We set up this adversarial relationships. Yes.
Yeah. We've forgotten Ubuntu. We've forgotten our principles. We've forgotten that our call is to be more humane. I mean, the call of ministry, the responsibility of ministry is to become more humane by divine imperative. And I'm not trying to scare anybody or create another denomination. I'm not proselytizing any of that stuff per se. What I'm saying though is that when we look at what is relevancy in ministry and what is responsible stewardship and leadership in our community and in our life in this connection, we may need to stop rehearsing our history solely and truly be Sankofa in our embodiment, that we actually go back and do some of the things that brought us life. And those things that bring life forward in ministry and in our connection. And I'm not discounting anybody, because here's the thing: we become competitive because that's the nature of democratic, capitalistic, and whiteness influence systems. That is not African. That is not indigenous culture. That is not the human and universal spirit of humanity. Those practices are contrary, just like the teachings of Jesus are revolutionary. There's better and there's enough for everyone. And maybe, again, I'm on my soapbox. Maybe there's an opportunity for us to live into that.
I think you're supposed to be on your soapbox. I think that is, those are very helpful observations about our responsibility as African American folks in addressing racism. So I am here for it. Rudy, so your colleagues have have made the point throughout these three segments that racism and anti-Blackness, more specifically, because we have other groups who experience racism as well. But today we're talking about the Black experience, and racism and anti-Blackness they are no doubt blocking the blessings, as the old folks say, and the efficacy of our denominational ministry. How do we convey that this is happening, and how do you, as a lead pastor of a church, start to help people move in a different direction? Because I know in your church you have a racially mixed congregation, as does Aaron, I think, and I think all of you have served those congregations. So how do we begin as ministers, as you as the lead pastors, get that movement going?
Well, first of all, Garlinda, thank you for this. And I want to acknowledge, I actually lead a room full of Black folk. White people, for the most part, have not really affiliated with St. John's over the last 28 years.
Okay.
They take field trips to St. John's
Okay.
to experience the experience. But yeah, but you know, this is what I'm finding. So white supremacist heteropatriarchy and colonial capitalism have plundered and created fortune around religion for years.
Hmm.
As a matter of fact, you know, we got here as a result of a religious decision, you know, a religious sojourn. So when we put in the context that white people, for the most part, have never had a problem being white and Christian at the same time, and have never had a challenge connecting their white Christianity to economic empowerment, to cultural dominance, to moving mission forward. You know, we are here as a result of a mission per se.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm suggesting is that Black people began to see their religious experience as an empowerment movement, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with making this an empowerment movement. Everyone else has in the universe, but we have always taken vows of poverty. We have always, you know, they're they were forced vows of poverty. Okay, you know, but along the way, you know, what I'm suggesting is that we make peace with our Blackness as a church, as a people, and as a church, and begin out of that peace we make with our Blackness to do three things I mentioned in the book. And you know, I'm gonna show the folk the book. Hey, that's the book right there. You know, three things I mentioned in the book that I think are important. Number one, that we create culturally relevant, non-religious themes designed to attract younger Black adults back to the institution as an empowerment base, and not just as something we check off the box before we go to brunch on Sunday. Number two, develop an all-inclusive learning context which integrates feeling with cognitive knowing. Now, what I'm saying is we do feeling well, all right, as a people. You know, but some of the fastest growing movements, religious movements in the country now, have put that feeling in a category, but they're teaching people how to live on purpose, how to live with power, how to live with dignity. And those are the things I remember in the church I grew up in. You know, those were key themes back when I was coming up. And lastly, Garlinda, provide safe places, and this is key, provide safe places for critical reflection on commonly held assumptions and differences. You know, when we think about how the church has, you know, we are facing forward, and there's one big head standing in the middle of the room, facing back the other way, who, you know, dialogue in that, you know, but at brunch, where the world has actually moved to, the world has moved from a pew to a brunch table, you know, pre-COVID, and I guarantee you, in these squares, those folk who used to get together for brunch are still getting together. You know, they might have their libation and their food in their hand, but they're still getting together. But are we intentionally looking at the potential of our platform as Black Christians who happen to be Methodists, or have we basically deferred our power to those who basically have said, you know what, as long as you serve us, we'll let you live. Okay.
Yeah. And that is theological. You're talking about when growing up, I think about the people, the old folks in my church, talking about what it meant to know God for yourself.
Exactly.
Know Jesus for yourself. It doesn't mean that a preacher can't help you. It doesn't mean a Sunday school teacher is, it doesn't mean intellect. I believe in intellect and learning. I'm a John Wesley person. But I think the conversation about knowing the truth, and one of the ways that we make peace with our Blackness, I think what I hear Aaron saying and Willis saying is that we have to engage not only in conversation, but in active worship and listening that goes beyond just, let me tell you what the Bible says, but to talk about how it's relevant to this struggle that we're in right now. I'm going to come back to Javon. Javon, I know you have a reputation as a teaching pastor. And I wanted to know, what kinds of things are you saying in your congregation? Is your congregation a cross-racial appointment?
It is, yes. So it's a predominantly white congregation. Yes, it is.
Okay. What kinds of things are you saying to white folks and to people of color about the importance of understanding this as a faith pursuit, as a way of being faithful Christians?
So if I start talking too long, just give me a wave, and that'll be our signal. Because this has been my challenge and my place of celebration. Because when God called us here to this place, I didn't understand why until we started going through this process. So to answer your question, again, I mentioned previously that I've served predominantly Black congregations as well. Mm-hmm. And I have served in white congregations as well. But this was the first time that we've been able to serve in a white congregation where we have had instances that has really challenged the congregation with regards to race and racism. And so, well, I talked about this in the book, actually, is that I knew I had lost my voice when things had happened and there was not a real space to voice that, not only to the community that looked like me,
right,
but also to the community that God had called me to serve.
Right.
Now that's challenging,
mm-hmm.
because often we think that God has really called us to to this community, to the people. And then I realized I didn't have anything to say to the people. It wasn't as though the content was not there, but I didn't know how to say it in a place that would be comfortable for them, and in a place that they could receive it. And that's when the challenging part came, when the Lord had to remind me that my calling was to help people to become more like Jesus Christ, not to help them to become more comfortable. Mm-hmm. And that's when it was revealed to me that there's a hear me clearly, there's a distinct difference between the God that is preached in Black churches and the God that is preached in white churches. Mm-hmm. It might be the same denomination in the same city, but the characteristics of God and how one lives out one faith can sometimes be dramatically different. And so I made the conscious decision that if the Lord had really called me here, then the Lord called Javon from Detroit, that knows a God of liberation, mm-hmm. and would not be afraid to do that. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned previously about how do senior pastors do that. Now, I'm not the senior pastor of the church, but I still think the Lord allowed me a great avenue and platform to really share my experience as a preacher, as a teacher, and even you. I think you asked Dr. Beasley this too as well, especially young preachers, mm-hmm. that long gone are the days where you got to wait until Sunday morning to be used to speak a word into people's lives.
Yes.
Right? You've got Facebook, you've got Instagram, you've got all these different avenues to really teach people, again, to help them to become more like Jesus Christ. So the first thing I did was, when we started talking about race and racism, we personalized it, right? So this is not something that goes on out in an unknown community, but one of your teaching pastors that I preach, when we're in person 3 Sundays out of the month,
Mhm.
when I'm in my when I'm walking my dog, I make sure I'm dressed appropriately.
Okay.
Right. When I'm in my home and it's cold, I'm not wearing my hooded sweatshirt because I'm not sure who's looking into my window. Right. And so these are not topics that are so beyond this community. But now you got somebody who preaches and teaches and serves you communion that is dealing with the trauma of this. So
Right.
that's the first thing we try to do was personalize it. And
Mhm.
then we try to educate.
Mhm.
Because again, you didn't wave at me, so I'm still going.
Yeah,
So one thing that we realized was that most people talked about social justice, but my wife mentioned something one day during a panel discussion when she called it biblical justice, and that's when the light bulb went off with this congregation specifically, because most people look at social justice as an extracurricular activity that was really geared around your passions,
Mhm.
not a biblical mandate that helps me live out my faith. So the question is not if I want to do social justice, but the question is if God has called me to become more like Jesus Christ, and Jesus, right, was involved in social justice, right? God, I have seen your misery, I've heard your cries, I'm concerned, and I will do something about it. So if we are really living out our call, then the work of justice is essential. Right? You don't even have the luxury of saying no to this.
Mhm.
And another thing we often heard was again, we got emails. We did a sermon series called Justice or Just Us,
Mhm.
and of course we got emails. And a lot of times people's main concern was you can't talk about politics in the pulpit. Again, I come from the Black church where we didn't have the luxury of not talking about politics
Well,
because politics affect people's lives, and
yeah.
the gospel has to speak to people's lives. So
Mhm.
if I'm not speaking about those things that affect my people, I'm not living out the gospel, right? I'm not doing what God has called me to do. And so we really just try to insert and remind people that Jesus was very political.
Mhm.
I mean, that's why they hung him up on the cross,
Mhm.
right? So because a liberating gospel had political implications.
Right.
And for some people, that's challenging. But if you've ever been held or if you have ever been in bondage of anything, right, that Jesus Christ is a liberating gospel. And if, we talk about God liberating us from sin, God liberating us from alcohol, God liberating us from all these other things, surely God can liberate us from economic oppression, from racial oppression. So you mean to tell me we can preach the gospel of liberation of all these other things, and yet we can't preach it when it comes to things that you might think are political, which, and again, I can almost feel your waves. I'm gonna just say this. It has helped me come to the place where I realized in this season that I think unity without responsibility is really overrated.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, that's what we've been trying. Let's come together. Let's unite. But until we do some real conversations around accountability and responsibility, unity is just really overrated.
Right.
And I really appreciate what you said, and it reminded me of something that Aaron had mentioned about moving from just nice dialogue
Mhm.
to action. And as we talk about, talking about the politics that affect the very lives of people, I like to remind folks there were all kinds of Jesus and Trump in 2020 signs last week. So it's not okay for us to sometimes talk about the reality of the intersection of our spiritual lives with our public lives, but it's okay for some people to usurp the gospel for ends that are not as pure. I want to thank all of you. This has been robust. I would remind people we're going to do this again, but this book, I'm Black, I'm Christian, I'm Methodist, has been a conversation changer for me. And I would recommend it to you. I want to thank our panelists, the Reverend Dr. Aaron Beasley, the Reverend Dr. Javon Caldwell Gross, the Reverend Dr. F. Willis Johnson, and Dr. Rudy Rasmus, who is the editor and a contributor to the book. Thank you all very much. God bless you, and let's go do something. Let's go do good. Bless you.
Amen.
Rudy, this is so exciting. I just, I was hanging on to every word, and I probably should have cut it off a little early. I was watching my time, but this is rich. And I think that I know that this is the kind of thing that goes on, these conversations at the Black Clergy Persons Conference. And I think that laity also need to be involved and taught in some incarnation. I think this has been so important as a conversation. And I think the book will be a jumping off point for changing how we do and minister in the United Methodist Church.
I agree. And I think the time has come for this conversation to hit center stage. I think the events that we have been witnessing over the last 4 years. We've been witnessing them before then,
right?
But the cover was snatched back.
Yes.
Over the last 4 years, and most recently, it just hit center stage, and we would be doing a disservice to our community if we didn't engage in some real dialogue about who are we, why are we, and what should we do next.
Yes. I said at the beginning, we are at a crossroads as a church. Right. We are at a crossroads as a people who are Christian, and as the Black community, we are at a crossroads.
Exactly.
And there are some things that we must do differently and talk about in order to ensure that we are doing the work that Jesus Christ has called us to.
Exactly. And Garlinda, the time is now.
The time is now.
When we think about the like your agency, religion and race, your agency is now positioned to help lead us into the dialogue of repentance and repair.
Yeah.
See, I wasn't a Methodist. I didn't know Methodism existed in 1968.
Yeah.
I didn't, I wasn't really doing church back then.
Yes, I knew that, and I read that again. And I feel that. I understand.
Yeah, but
I'm afraid of Methodist, but I understand.
That's right. But now is the time for repair.
Yes.
And when we think about, the great work of those who came before us, those leaders, those committed lay folk who built churches, many of the churches that we are now selling. We think about those great pastoral leaders who led those congregations, and now we are wrestling with vitality.
Yes.
Religion and race is what this is about.
Yeah, with our very presence in our communities, there is so much opportunity and pain and potential. And in many cases, the United Methodist Church is just absent. And the Black United Methodist Church is currently in many ways disempowered. And I think part of it is the institutional racism, but part of it is how do we get ourselves together and say, as a couple of our colleagues said, our time under God is now.
Exactly.
And
I think about the 9 authors, the other 9 authors, and we've heard them in these conversations, and we see how gender shouldn't be an issue.
Yes,
but gender is an issue. We see how sexual orientation shouldn't be an issue.
Yes,
but it is an issue. We see how even reconciling our own journeys have caused question as to whether or not are we in the right place.
Mhm, mhm.
But I want to point all of the viewers and all of those who will ultimately pick up this book to make sure you look at Dr. Ross's 10 points in his chapter that really point to some of the issues that need to be addressed as we turn the corner as a people, as a faith,
Mhm,
even as a denomination.
mhm, mhm. Yes, I think those are very good points. Please read. Every chapter is a jewel. I want to thank the contributors for their hard work on this book. Again, the book is I'm Black, I'm Christian, I'm Methodist. And the book is available for sale. It is produced by Abingdon Press. And it's available. I would recommend it highly, not only to other African American pastors. I would recommend it to anyone who is interested in and called to help address racism and become a person of faith against racism and for flourishing. And so I want to thank Dr. Rasmus, and I want to thank the contributors, and thank you all who have joined us today. Thank you for your indulgence, your questions, and thank you for your faith. God bless you.
God bless you.